Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Darrel Reid, Vice President of Public Affairs with the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada. You know, there's certainly no shortage of issues to talk about in British Columbia right now when it comes to construction, infrastructure, labor policy, and government spending. At the center of a lot of that debate is a question PCA has been raising for years. Are we making it easier to get much-needed public infrastructure built, or harder? PCA and our Labour partner CLAC have been outspoken, to say the least, in opposing the NDP government's so-called Community Benefits Agreements regime, or CBA, arguing that it limits competition, restricts worker choice, and makes it harder for qualified contractors to compete for public work. Today, we're also going to talk about the new private members bill introduced by MLA Kiel Giddens, and what that could mean for fair and open procurement in British Columbia. Well, my guest today is Dan Baxter, PCA's Regional Director for BC. Before joining PCA, Dan held senior roles with both the BC Chamber of Commerce and the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. He spent years working at the intersection of business advocacy, public policy, and government relations in BC, not to mention working in the Minister's Regional Office in BC. So we're delighted to have you, Dan. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Darrel.
Well, Dan, I was going to start with the weather since you're in Vancouver, but I assume there's at least a decent chance it involves clouds and rain.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it goes here in BC. We are in a lull between rain periods, but that's the joy of living in a rainforest.
I think I recall when I lived there, there was usually a pretty deep likelihood that you'd have about 6 weeks of cloud and rain during the winter, and you must be just about getting out of that now. Is that right?
Sure, that's right.
Okay, well, listen, weather aside, there's certainly no shortage of things happening in British Columbia right now. And before we get into the new bill from Kiel Giddens, I want to start with the issue PCA has been talking about, maybe even yelling about very politely for years now, and that's the province's Community Benefits Agreement regime brought in by former NDP Premier John Horgan. So for people who may not know PCA all that well, give us a quick version, like who is PCA and what do we stand for in BC?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Darrel. Progressive Contractors Association of Canada is an industry association that represents progressively unionized contractors and their skilled workers across Canada, including right here in BC. So what does that mean? PCA, basically in the work that we do day to day, especially on the public affairs side of the equation, we support a modern labor model that is built around concepts like collaboration, flexibility, productivity, and I think probably most importantly, worker choice. So if you really to boil it really down to something, Darrel, I think what PCA stands for is that we're pro-union, just not unions tied to the traditional building labor model. So that's meaning that we want to basically represent our contractors who utilize a wall-to-wall union structure, meaning that they hire their workers, they are then represented or become part of a CLAC union or other wall-to-wall union, meaning all trades are represented by one union. Makes for things to be more efficient on the work site, more productivity. And that's basically the key. The key here being the fact that we want to stand up for our contractors' ability to be their strong voice for fair, open, and competitive procurement structures. So they can utilize the model that they've developed over years that allow them to basically build projects on time, on budget, and to really, make sure that that stuff gets built in BC and across Canada. So really what it comes down to, and I think you alluded to it, that we here at PCA, we want to see public work getting built by as many qualified builders as possible and not seeing that work basically going to politically preferred labor groups.
And that's an important context, isn't it? Because this really is not a debate about whether unions belong in construction. From PCA's point of view, it's about whether government is structuring public procurement fairly, right?
Yes.
So let's get right into it. The PCA and CLAC have been pushing back on the CBA regime from day one. Well, what in your view is the real problem with it?
Yeah, CBA, community benefit agreements, let's just first kind of reorient it. That's a lot of fancy words, community benefits. It's something that we do all support it, whether it's the construction community, general public. Really, these are just project labor agreements, and in particular, restricted project labor agreements. So what does that boil down to? The core problem is that the CBA or restricted PLA is not neutral. It's not neutral on the labor model that gets used. So it's basically built around the idea that preferred unions that are politically connected to the government of the day, the BC NDP government, they get basically contracts awarded to them because, and forcing contractors or workers to have to go work within the traditional building trade model. And of course, that advantages certain building trades unions over others. Basically, there's a lot of companies that don't bid because they don't necessarily want to see their workforce become part of the building trade model. Their workers want to either be part of a progressively unionized or alternative union structure, or some might choose to be non-union. So those are really all the choices, going back to what we talked about earlier, the worker choices that those workers and those companies make. But instead, what we get is obviously politically motivated decisions that uses the procurement model to basically sideline or reshape the labor market, instead of simply getting the projects built that we need here in BC and across Canada. So really, at the end of the day, it really comes down to government should not be using taxpayer-funded projects to basically pick effectively winners or losers when it comes to building our province.
So in your view, this was never just about project delivery. It was also about who government wanted to favor in the labor market. When you say the regime is exclusionary, what does that actually look like on the ground for contractors and workers in BC?
Yeah, and I think the key here is, again, there's lots of qualified contractors. These to get all of these projects built, there's a certain level you have to be at, whether it's in terms of just size, standards, having the workforce needed. But effectively, because they can't utilize the model they want, these qualified contractors find themselves effectively on the outside looking in when it comes to building major projects. So things like here in BC, the Patello Bridge replacement, the Broadway subway line, Cowichan Hospital, those are just a few of the big projects where our company members, or contractors, weren't able to bid without their workforce having to become part of the building trades. So the other side of this, because we've been talking a lot about, obviously, the contractors, the skilled workers they hire, they're effectively sidelined as well. And that's a big piece of the puzzle, because these are skilled men and women that are in the trades, whether it's welders, pipe fitters, you name the trade, heavy equipment operators, that they're all basically wanting and able to basically build our province, make sure that their kids get all the benefits and future generations get all the benefits. But because they're not part of that preferred government framework, they basically can't get to work and build the province with everyone else. So effectively, when you kind of boil it down a bit, it comes down to the fact that, what we see here in BC in particular, fewer bids on projects, less worker choice, that workers who are represented by other labor models are not getting the opportunities, and less flexibility in the labor pool, which in turn narrows that field of competition down, and it usually leads to the increase in cost on projects and or delays on projects. So if you're qualified, in our opinion, if you're qualified to build a project, you should be able to bid on it and work on it. That's just the very least when it comes to a public sector project that is using taxpayer dollars.
And when it comes to workers, those numbers are not insubstantial, are they? I mean, I've read research that says that basically, 100% of the public infrastructure work is now devoted to 15% of the skilled labor force in British Columbia. That means 85% of BC workers throughout the Lower Mainland, on the island, up north, are cut out of projects that their tax dollars are helping pay for.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it, Darrell. And, when we look at the numbers, the building trades representing 15% of the workforce, that means between alternative unions, progressive unions like CLAC and others, and the non-union workforce, that's 85% of workers that are not able to access these projects. These aren't theoretical. This is, these are members. These are men and women that are able to build our province, that just can't get onto the job site, can't pick up a tool and get working. And it has obviously a lot of effects, in terms of training. We talk about training and needing more people trained. Well, if they're not able to kind of get onto a project, it's kind of hard to get trained up. And obviously CLAC, they represent skilled workers. And And sometimes that gets missed, I think, in this conversation is that we think about, skilled workers as only the building trades, or at least the building trades that traditional unions like to represent themselves as the only ones that represent skilled workers. Well, no, a lot of the men and women out there in the workforce, they're represented by other forms, whether in the non-union world or CLAC, and that these are skilled trade peoples who want to have the same chance to build public sector infrastructure. And, again, one of the things that we'll probably talk about, or, I'm sure we'll pick up on, a little bit later in the conversation, is when we talk about costs going over, and the government's talking a lot about how, skilled labor shortages is leading to cost increases on these projects. That's why we're seeing all these cost overruns. Well, the government's own choices are the ones that are restricting that labor pool and leading to those very cost overruns that they're starting to complain about. And we're starting to see in our budgets repacing of projects so they can stay on budget or try to maintain cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think just swinging back to the labor piece a little bit, in other words, I think what this boils down to, PCA is saying that if you're good enough to do the job, government should not be shutting the door before you even get to the starting line. And that's really what's hit such a nerve with PCA members and with CLAC, isn't it?
Yes. No, that's exactly it. Again, these aren't theoretical kind of conversations. These are very practical, on-the-ground conversations. We're talking about real employers investing in their training, investing in apprenticeships, investing in long-term skilled workforce development. CLAC workers are skilled tradespeople who want those chances to build public sector projects. They're taxpayers. A lot of them, they all, 10,000 of them live here in BC and are building our province. And our members aren't asking for special treatment on this, that we are just asking not to be excluded from the opportunity to bid on these projects and help build BC.
Yeah, that's an important distinction, because this isn't a request for an advantage. It's a request for a level playing field. And I know you've already alluded to the fact that this has, training and apprenticeship implications, and community benefits, which all sound pretty reasonable to people. We take exception to the way that the BC government has framed this thing, and the inevitable costs that the taxpayers of BC have to afford. So I'm going to move on here a little bit and just zoom out. But when it comes to getting much needed infrastructure built, BC already has a big challenge. Add in the province's much bigger budget problem, which we just did a bulletin on, and this seems like exactly the wrong time to be limiting competition. Why does that make this debate even more important?
Yeah, well, and you obviously hit on a really sore spot, I think, for a lot of British Columbians right now. Some recent polling just came out, and this is probably the least popular budget since the HST budget that then Premier Gordon Campbell introduced back in the 2010s. And I think a lot of British Columbians are feeling the pain. We are seeing obviously very record high deficits. This next coming year, $13.3 billion of taxpayer deficit, which is going to be about $11 billion the year after that. It's going to stay double digits for the next year after that, definitely over $10 billion. And what this all means is deficits, debt. What does that mean? Every year the government can't bring in the revenue to cover their expenses. That deficit becomes debt. And now what we're seeing in BC is that by the time this fiscal plan is done in 2028 to 2029, we'll have $189 billion in debt on our province's books. So that means for us as British Columbians, with more debt, that means interest rates go up. So more and more of our provincial budget will be taken up by interest payments. I think I heard somewhere that the interest payments alone will be the third highest cost in the provincial budget, after obviously healthcare and education. So how does this all connect into what we're talking about? Really what it comes down to is these decisions, the fact that the government is struggling to balance their books. Every decision government makes is under a microscope and should be under a microscope. And bad procurement gets even more expensive when money is tight. And the BC government needs more infrastructure. We have a deficit of infrastructure. There's roads that need to be built. There's bridges that need to be built. There's hospitals, schools, you name the infrastructure, that is there. People need it and want it. And if the government doesn't have the money in the coffer, either we take on more debt, or what we start to see is, again, very fancy language like repacing, which is effectively just delays. That just means delaying, which actually comes, delay. It sounds, we'll just delay and do it later. Well, obviously with delays comes more added cost, potentially cost of material goes up, all those sorts of things. Supply chain issues might might happen. So, again, it's a nice short-term, concept to delay a project, but it does come obviously potentially with added cost later down the road versus if we can create a model and a structure where procurement is open to as many bidders as possible, get every possible worker working, get every contractor that's qualified on the job site working, we can start to control and maintain some of those cost issues and get people working, get more people working means more tax dollars coming in. At the same time that, we can build projects today while costs are where they are right now versus in the future. There's lots of benefits by the government just, looking at opening up and not being so restrictive on the procurement side of things to help them manage the cost pressures and budget pressures that they have with the current budget.
Yeah, and to be really clear, this is not just abstract economic theory. I mean, you live on the south side of the Fraser River. I lived on the south side of the Fraser River for 10 years. And that involved a trip under the river every day to get into town. And nothing has really changed. There's been a lot of talk, but, the fact that the government is so constraining means that, everybody who lives in, White Rock, South Surrey, Ladner, where you're from, they face another, 5 years or more of these incredible lineups and reduce productivity for the province.
Well, and Darrel, if I can just, really quick on Massey Tunnel, and this is getting really local here, but it's a great example of a project that has been delayed. It's actually going to be another project that will be restricted. So again, only access to working on the project will be for those that are part of the building trades model only. And, right now they have that in the books as a $4.3 billion budgeted project. But most people, even within the government zone, they haven't talked a lot about the cost, beyond that, because everyone's expecting that $4.3 billion to be a lot higher. And even from the talking pundits to the political class to just most people who kind of follow these budgets, 4.3 is considered very rosy with where these projects have been going. And with the fact that it's going to be restricted, that I think we should be ready to see a bit of a sticker shock when that gets reannounced.
Yeah. So let's bring it back to, at the heart of this thing, there's a serious contradiction between what the government of BC is saying and what they're likely to produce. Government says it wants to build more, build faster, and spend smarter, but its labor and procurement policies are making that harder. That's a serious contradiction, isn't it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. We know, obviously, from various studies, Carter's think tank has done a great job when they compare open models to closed labor models and the savings and the cost overruns that kind of go there. It's generally somewhere between 20 to 30% because companies, have efficiencies built in using their wall-to-wall union model that they can manage their workforce a little bit more efficiently and be more on point with budget and managing projects. But we also know the fact that, government is crying, labor shortages. We know there's labor shortages. That's part of the reason why, our guys, our members want to be on the job site so they can be training up and helping to train up apprentices. And then actually on a side note, when it comes to apprenticeship, generally those in the non-union and CLAC structure, we make up, roughly about 82% of apprenticeships. So it's not that, our members and others in the non-union model aren't, doing their part for apprenticeship. They know they need to help train up the next generation of workforce. But when government basically is restricting these projects to just a narrow group of bidders and contractors that use just a subset of the construction workforce, I think, again, as you alluded to, is about 15%. That sidelines, a good chunk of the workforce, that, means that these labor shortages are keeping qualified people off key projects and that the rhetoric and the policy aren't matching right now, that we need government to kind of be more open. They're facing, again, fiscal pressures that they need to change kind of, to be less ideological and more open to respecting taxpayers' money.
I know we're a couple of policy wonks here, and it gets us quite frustrated that the public cannot seem to pick up on what the benefits of, expanded labor competition is, and then company competition is, and what it benefits British Columbians for. And that's really where this stops becoming an inside baseball labor issue and becomes a much broader policy issue that touches everybody. And so that brings us to Kiel Giddens' bill. For someone hearing about it for the first time, What would this bill actually do?
Yeah, great question. Really, just in plain English, it would stop public owners, i.e. government, any other government entity, from requiring contractors to be tied to a specific union or labor group as a condition of bidding. Basically, to really kind of boil that down into like one kind of phrase, the bidding process would be labor neutral procurement. So basically, whether you're connected to the building trades, whether you're using alternative unions, progressively unionized unions like CLAC and other unions like that, or maybe for those that are qualified in the non-union space, everyone gets to bid and you don't look at which model they use when you're making that decision on bidding. So what does that do? It would help ensure that all qualified contractors can compete on an equal footing, that there's no one group having a hand tied behind the back, so to speak. And really effective what it allows is that, and government's not generally the best when it comes to picking winners and losers. By basically being labor model neutral for procurement, it really takes the government out of picking winners and losers and lets the best qualified contractors rise to the top and get the job done for all British Columbians.
It's kind of breathtaking to say that, that just seems like common sense.
Yeah.
But then such as the situation in BC, that common sense doesn't always play all that well in the public sphere. So I guess the question would be, what kind of reaction has the bill? The bill was just introduced, wasn't it, last week, I believe?
Yes, March 5th. So we're not even a week kind of since it's been introduced.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of reaction has the bill generated so far?
Yeah, I would say it's probably been, what most would have expected. Supporters of the bill are seeing it as, an issue of fairness, competition. Opponents, they obviously see it as a threat to the status quo. And I guess if you're really to unpack that, and we talked a little bit about this, is that they're making it out to be this is an attack on skilled workers. Well, it's not an attack on skilled workers, because that's actually very presumptuous to make it about, that skilled workers are being attacked, when there are so many skilled workers in the, CLAC union, alternative union space, and the non-union space. Those are all skilled men and women just as much as those in the building trade. So that's why this bill really does matter, that it's really, very interesting now for the next, when this bill comes to second reading. And we have a new process here in BC where private members' bills now can be debated, and it'll get 2 hours of real debate about whether the government should be in the business of picking winners and losers. It allows for us, at PCA, some of our partners like ICBA, who've been publicly backing a fair, open procurement system for a long time, to have some airwaves, some bandwidth to talk about these issues. But of course, we're going to see also on the other side, the IU, OE, Local 115, the building trades, they're going to be out there publicly as well. But it's going to be a good, lively debate.
Yeah, and for people who don't spend a lot of time watching the legislative television channel or, reading constitutional books or government policies for debate, why don't you explain what a private member's bill is and why it still matters?
Yeah, great. Now we get to really geek out. I love it. That's exactly it. My political science, juices are flowing here. All right, private members' bills. Yeah, it's a tool in the legislature for MLAs that aren't members of cabinet to be able to introduce legislation effectively. And, the process is definitely a little more prescribed. So there's just certain things that, these bills can't be, like they can't raise taxes or influence, the treasury. Those have to come from cabinet ministers that represent the crown. But pretty much almost every other matter that, that could be kind of out there that might be an issue where, MLAs are hearing from their constituents, other stakeholders, that gives them an opportunity to raise issues that normally wouldn't get raised. So if you think about, the issue around community benefits agreement, back in 2018 when that was introduced, that was just the government came out and said, we're doing this. And everything was kind of, packaged within the frame of government, and it was fait accompli in terms of the decision and very little debate and discussion within the legislature, at least. So a private member's bill allows an MLA like MLA Kiel Giddens to basically come to the floor and bring forward an issue that does impact the budget, at high level, obviously not in terms of raising money or cutting money, but it offers a solution on how they can kind of manage the fiscal pressures that government faces by opening up the procurement model. So again, it's a really good tool that allows MLAs to debate and get things on the agenda, so we can actually have a chance to test ideas. And does that policy, the community benefit agreement policy, and other restrictive PLA policies, does that kind of stand up to scrutiny? And it can also hopefully build some momentum for broad reform down the road, whether it's with the current government, not that I'm holding my breath on that, or when there is a change in government, that it starts to kind of normalize the conversation. And to your point earlier, hopefully helps people just understand a little bit more about the world of construction and how they can be a partner in helping to manage those fiscal pressures, so it can kind of keep taxes low, keep the debt and deficit under control, as just one small step in that direction.
Well, I don't know, Dan. I mean, it sounds a little bit too much democratic and, public facing for BC politics these days. But here's hoping, right?
Yeah.
So why did PCA decide to work with Kiel Giddens on this particular piece of legislation?
Yeah. Partly because it's very practical. I think that is a lot of the work that we do at PCA is just practical steps to support our members and raise voice to their issues that are affecting their ability to operate and grow and be successful. In particular, I think working with someone like MLA Kiel Giddens, that's someone I've known. I've known Kyle now probably close to 20 years, and have we've been in the trenches together, and have our careers have kind of rised up together. And in a previous life, again, someone like Kyle, he used to work for TransCanada Energy, or TC Energy. He was very much involved in this link project, and a lot of our contractors and workers were a big part in building that gas link from the gas fields in the Northeast to facilities like LNG Canada on the coast. And so working with someone like that who understands a little bit about the model and obviously what it means, in terms of efficiencies and helping to keep projects under control in terms of cost and time. He was a good guy to partner with when he approached, and we started talking about it, and we thought, yeah, he's offering a common sense solution reform here. Again, this is not about partisanship as well, just to be clear. This is not, a partisan issue, BC Conservatives versus BC NDP. It really is about good public policy, and having someone like Kyle willing to stand up and put his name to a bill like this that really respects, the whole construction industry as well as taxpayers. It just seemed like the right thing to do to be part of this process with him.
Yeah, and we should just be clear too. The bill is not just criticizing the status quo. It's trying to move an actual solution, which is a kind of uniquely refreshing concept these days in construction policy in British Columbia, right?
Exactly. One of the things actually, Darrel, just before we move on to, it's why was PCA wanting to get involved, roll up our sleeves, getting to know our contractors and in all the hard work that their men and women do to help build our province. And, we had this little saying around, we were talking about it, they use every tool, in the toolbox to get things built. At PCA, I feel like that's what we try to do at the public affairs side of it as well. We try to use every tool in our toolbox. And as a couple of political people who've been within, inside the machinations of government and know all the various levers, again, here in BC with this new private members tool where issues can be raised and brought forward to debate. Again, it seemed like a good opportunity for us to pull out one of those tools in our toolbox and, again, raise voice to issues that have been on our members' minds.
Makes sense to me. Now, of course, this being the issue that it is, and BC being the province that it is, some people will hear this and say, PCA is just pushing back against the building trades. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, no, that really misses the point at the end of the day. I think we talked about a little bit when we started this conversation. PCA is a pro-union organization. Our contractors are a unionized workforce. They're alternative. In the sense that, they don't have the hiring halls, they don't have, the siloed craft industry trade representations. It's a wall-to-wall structure. And that has, again, certain benefits and advantages that we feel, make it easier. Our members feel, our contractors feel it makes it easier for them to manage their business model by having a workforce that is name hired and represented by a wall-to-wall union. And, that's the key here, that this isn't an attack, necessarily on the building trades, that we have a competitive, model that is different from theirs. And it's making sure that both models have equal space to operate, that we're not picking one over the other. I think that is a key fact that just has to be repeated, that this is not, we're asking only to use our model in these bidding processes. It's just leave it completely neutral as part of the bidding process, so that the best bids wins, the best contractors win, and that everyone can bid on these projects. So yeah, it really is about, not advantaging one or privileging one group, one union labor model over the other. And that's really what this is about. It's fair competition, not anti-union, not it's anti-exclusion, not anti-union.
So what about the argument that we hear increasingly, that this restrictive CBA model is really needed to protect wages, safety, and job quality?
Yeah, that is such a red herring, really, at the end of the day. And we reject that idea that open competition somehow means lower standards. Our contractors and workers, they deliver quality projects safely and professionally. And that's why, again, we use the word qualified contractors. It's not to sacrifice standards. These are unionized workers that our contractors work with the representatives of those workers to hammer out collective agreements. They're trained. They meet all the standards of training for skilled trades recognition. And they build some of the biggest projects in BC. We talked about Coastal GasLink. They worked on the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. They're building wood fiber LNG. You kind of name it. They're right there building some of the biggest contracts. If you actually put a dollar value here in BC, our contractors and their skilled workers, represented by CLAC, have built close to 100, if not over $100 billion worth of infrastructure projects here in British Columbia. So, these are qualified contractors. They are, representative of skilled trades training, and they meet all those standards of professionalism and safety, and these are well-paid workers. So again, this isn't some race to the bottom as the building trades like to make it out to be.
Yeah, so we're not really talking about chump change there. This is a serious piece of public policy infrastructure. So you and I both had a little bit of a political background. We know what talking points are about. Yeah, so I guess I would just ask you, if the government was serious about fixing this, what would be a more practical procurement model? What would it actually look like in, 5 or 6 points?
Yeah. Really what it comes down to, and it's Kiel Giddens' bill, is probably the model of simplicity about it. Start with labor neutrality. Just get out any decisions that are around picking one model over another model. Let all qualified workers bid on the projects. Let's get more bids going. Focus on outcomes-based decision-making. Generally, again, safety, quality, cost control, delivery. All those things go into and should be what goes into a bid, not the labor model they decide to use. Of course, if government wants apprenticeships, local hiring, Indigenous partnership, I think we all want those things. Again, those can be worked into an agreement. They have been worked into agreements into the past, in terms of making sure that we're hiring, more Indigenous people. We're getting more apprenticeships going. And I think, just apply those principles broadly and making sure that we're rewarding performance over, preferred affiliations.
Well, that sounds eminently reasonable, and I hope our listeners here will take note and maybe talk with their families about it around the dinner table, because this has practical implications. Now, let's just get back to the private member's bill a little bit and what happens next. So the bill has been introduced. It passed first reading and is expected to come up for second reading on April 13th. So what should people be watching for?
Yeah. When this comes up again, I think you'll start to see, some of the talking points and the various organizations we talked about, again, rise to the top and get out their points. So what to watch for: those who are willing to defend labor neutral procurement. Again, the idea that, picking one model over the other. hopefully you're going to see more and more people kind of rise up and say, hey, you want to get everybody working, not just, select groups. Watch, whether opponents engage honestly on the issue. We've talked a little bit about it. They like to muddy the water and create these red herring kind of arguments that it's about, lowering standards. It's about, underpaying or paying less. They'll find all these other issues that sound kind of like, like they're obviously the core of the issue. But as we talked about, that, the standards are just as high within our model. The wages are high because these are unionized workers. So, let's see if they're going to engage honestly on the issue. Watch whether the legislature acknowledges the province build problem and budget problems. Again, that's going to be more on the government side of the debate, because both sides get to stand up and talk. I'm sure the opposition will highlight the fact this is going to have an impact on budget and it could be a part of the solution. Will government also acknowledge that they have a problem and they need to find solutions as well? And of course, debate matters beyond obviously the fate of this one bill. I would say the larger question is whether BC is prepared to open the field, or are they just going to kind of keep working to narrow it and benefiting their friends?
So even beyond the bill itself, this is a useful test of who is willing to stand up for fair access and common sense procurement. So April 13th is actually an important day. We do have a legislature that welcomes the public and interested people to come and listen to the debate. So why do you think it matters for our listeners, our PCA members, the general public, maybe just the skilled tradespeople that can't find work right now? Why should they show up or be involved closely in this debate?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Darrell. It really does come down to putting faces and names to the issue. That, at the end of the day, sometimes when debate happens, it's kind of done in a bubble. But really, especially this issue when it comes to building our province, that, we're talking about real employers, we're talking about real workers. So it puts a face, to the issue. It allows, especially, on the opposition side, this was brought forward as a private member's bill. This is the tool that they could use. It allows them to highlight and raise awareness for people who live in their communities that might be impacted by this. They're not able to get work on these projects because they're cut out. So it basically raises visibility for those people who are affected by this policy and its direction. It shows that obviously the industry is in support of fair and open procurement, making sure that we obviously represent the contractor side, and when contractors show up and say, hey, we want to use the models that we've built and developed that allow us to do our job effectively, getting people to work and helping to build the province and doing it in a way that respects taxpayer dollars and hopefully keeps more of that money in people's pockets. That's where they can kind of show up and have a kind of a presence. And of course, PCA's presence, is there to say this is not a niche issue. It seems like you use the word inside baseball sometimes, but really this does have an impact on all British Columbians, that if we aren't building the projects as cost effectively as we can, that either means we're building less infrastructure or we're paying more for it, which is the worst case scenario, that we're getting basically less infrastructure for more money, less for more. And that's just, again, at a time when you're looking at $13 billion deficits and increasing debt and increasing taxation, that's really hard, for, I think, a lot of British Columbians. We should really be paying attention, because these are our dollars that we want to make sure are going to the right causes and to all British Columbians.
So if the government of BC is serious about building more infrastructure and spending taxpayer dollars wisely, what has to change?
Well, simply, government just has to stop treating procurement as a political sorting mechanism, really, at the end of the day. We need to, build a system that gets everybody working. It needs to trust the full capacity of the industry. Again, when you talk about 85% of workers, being excluded from certain projects, again, what we see from that is we have to then repace. We have to delay these projects. Again, government talks about how it's a shortness, a labor shortage is leading to cost increase. Well, that's because the policies they are choosing aren't accessing the full capacity of the industry. It just really, at the end of the day, Darrell, I think it needs to stop restricting access based on labor affiliation. That was really at the core of what the issue is. It shouldn't be about which union cards you're carrying. That's a choice for workers to make, and just let the best model win. When we do that, it needs, obviously this comes down to getting rules that are just fair and open and focused on getting projects built well. Again, we talked about the fact that these are qualified workers. You can set all those criteria to make sure that we're getting the projects we need done the way they need to be done right. And of course, if BC wants to build more and spend smarter, it just needs more builders on the field, not fewer.
Well said, Dan. Well, Dan, really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with me today.
Yeah, thanks, Darrell. It was a pleasure.
That was Dan Baxter, PCA's Regional Director for British Columbia. As Dan made clear, this is about more than one bill or one policy fight. It goes to a bigger question. If British Columbia is serious about getting much-needed infrastructure built, managing costs, and workers help getting the job done? We sure hope so. Thanks for listening.
In this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.